What is up, duelists? We've just gotten a pretty exciting Forbidden and Limited List update, and I'm here today to talk to you guys about my first impression of the new format, what the best decks of the format are. Not just that, it's not just going to be a tier list. I've also included some example deck lists for some of these decks, especially the ones that have changed with the Forbidden and Limited list, you know, where you got to like remove some cards and replace them with others. So I've sat down and I've crafted some maybe baseline lists that you can start from if you decide to pick up a deck that was just hit on this ban list or has changed. Let me know what you think of this change. Does this add valuable info to the video, or does it just like make it longer than necessary? But for some of the decks, not all of them, I've sat down and I've provided a little bit of a starting point where I would start, and I'm going to explain why I've made those changes as we go. So let's jump right in. We've got quite the lists of decks to talk about, and we're going to start talking about Mitsurugi. Now, Mitsurugi, of course, a deck that has changed in multiple ways because it was also playable in multiple ways. You've got the pure Mitsurugi deck and you've got the Mitsurugi hybrid variations. I've left off Mitsurugi Yami from this tier list because, quite frankly, in my opinion, that deck just doesn't really exist anymore because the bridge has been burned, Yami has been weakened, Mitsurugi has been weakened, Herald is banned, so I just don't think Mitsurugi Yami really is a deck anymore. Pure Mitsurugi, on the other hand, though, I think is still a strong contender in the upcoming format, quite frankly. You might not think that it's that easy to replace 2 copies of Habakiri, but I honestly think it is. So I've crafted a little bit of a first draft here of a Mitsurugi deck post ban list, and it doesn't really change that much from what it was beforehand. So what I've done here is I've replaced the extra copies of Habakiri with more copies of Aramasa, of course, and I'm maximizing on Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Prosperity. What this does is 2 things. It replaces the consistency that you lose from the extra starters that Habakiri added to the deck, but it also makes it so that you solve one other problem that now exists because Habakiri is at 1, and that is that you run out of Mitsurugi cards faster, right? Like, you need Mitsurugi cards in your deck to search because that's what's required to bring your ritual monsters back from the graveyard over and over again. And since pure Mitsurugi tends to be a little bit more grindy than other versions of the deck, you know, it's not as explosive or as auto win when it goes first. So you have to play a little bit of a longer game sometimes. So not running out of Mitsurugi searches in the deck is really important, which is also why I think extra copies of Aramasa are the correct thing to do over something like Manju or Lamia, which are also options. But I think having the more Mitsurugi names in your deck is important. And that is also the reason why I've added Magatama into the mix alongside Great Purification, because I do really think it's very important to have sufficient Mitsurugi cards in your deck to keep resolving your Mitsurugi names. Another thing I was considering is cutting 1 ritual spell, because now that you only have 4 ritual monsters, it's actually not that likely to draw the Mitsurugi ritual spell paired with a ritual. But I still think, like, once again, Mitsurugi names in the deck, even if the chance is small to draw this together with Murakumo or Futsu or Habakiri, it still is a little bit of percentage points in terms of consistency. So for now, this is where I would start, and quite frankly, I expect this deck to still feel relatively strong in the upcoming format. Like, I think this deck is pretty fine. So pure Mitsurugi, strong contender. Moving on, Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul is interesting to me because it doesn't get strictly worse from this ban list. You know, K9 Vanquish Soul has received hits on this ban list, but it also receives some cards back. So I like the direction that Vanquish Soul is going personally, because removing some K9 cards and adding more Vanquish Soul into the deck is pretty cool. And honestly, losing 2 copies of Holy Sue, from the perspective of having played K9 Vanquish Soul at YCS Bologna and doing pretty well with it, Holy Sue was so inconsistent in this version of the deck because you just didn't have enough Vanquish Soul / fire monsters. Honestly, losing 2 Holy Sues barely matters with how the deck was. I like it. I think the deck is in a good spot. I think it is also a very strong contender. I'm a little hesitant to put it in the best decks category, even though it very well could be. But I'm just like a little bit scared that if you focus more on Vanquish Soul gameplay and less on K9, which is what I would personally do, I'm a little afraid that the ceiling of the deck, or like the board breaking capabilities, mainly against Draco Tail, you know, that used to be its best matchup, right? The main benefit of Vanquish Soul K9 was that it beat Draco Tail. And I'm not sure if this is the case after Burst Protocol anymore, because of course we're not only looking at these decks post ban list, we're also including Burst Protocol into our thought process here. Draco Tail gets more powerful. It gets harder to break a Draco Tail board when they add the Fallen of the White and all the branded interruptions to it. And that makes the Vanquish Soul matchup not as easy anymore against Draco Tail. But Nonetheless, I think it is a strong contender. I have crafted a first draft of Vanquish Soul. What I've done, of course, remove the 2 Holy Sues, add the Raisins, and to Stake Your Soul. This is also a list that is using a very minimal K9 package. I've decided to cut the Lantern and the Forced Release, like all of the quote-unquote bricky K9 cards, because I'm just basically trying to play pure Vanquish Soul here, with the K9 cards just being like a little bit of an extra push, so that I can use, let's say, Holy Sue plus Jiaolong to go into Ripper to search for Izuna or Jokul if I have another level 5, or Noroi if I still have my normal summon. Like, additional pushes. Jokul should still be a really good draw because you have a bunch of level 5s in your deck, and then Izuna still is a really good hand trap, and then of course all of the K9 cards have the correct attributes so that you can use your Holy Sue or other Vanquish Soul effects with them. But for the most part, with more Vanquish Soul, Raisin, and Stake Your Souls, I'm happy to go back to quote-unquote pure Vanquish Soul. That's just using a small K9 package. Of course, there also is the option to still play like more K9 cards. The reason I didn't want to do that is I didn't want to lean too much into the combo aspect of the deck. That makes it weaker into Fuva. And honestly, I don't want too many normal summons with multiple Norois, Mad Loves, and Raisins. I think that is just too many normal summons. So I'm happy just playing 3 Raisin, 3 Mad Love, and 1 copy of Noroi, just in case I want to search it. And that gives you 7 normal summons plus Rhoda, which I think is acceptable. It's also, this is a little bit biased because this is just the version of the deck that I know I'm going to enjoy the most. So I've even added Pot of Extravagance into the mix because I remembered the deck being a little bit inconsistent before the K9 cards came out. So the extra deck is like a first draft of what it could look like if you're playing Pot of Extravagance, just to give you an idea of what a more pure Vanquish Soul approach could look like if we're removing some K9s from the mix. And I do think a deck like this could be pretty strong. Of course, maybe with Draco Tail in the mix, more K9 cards could be better, and higher ceiling could also be better. But that is something for everyone to experiment with. This is just what I would start with if I wanted to play K9 Vanquish Soul, and it is on the list of decks that I want to try. K9 Crystron. K9 Crystron is probably back in the format, and that is concerning. Inclusion going back to 3 and them not hitting Spell Canceller makes me a little bit worried. I'm not going to play this deck. It is not my style of deck, but that doesn't mean it's not strong. I'm hesitant to, like, it's either here or here. The reason I don't think it's that crazy, actually, is because Jokul was the best card in this deck, by far. Like, when this deck opens Jokul plus one of the Crystrons, it is really, really hard to stop. And losing 2 copies of Jokul and 2 copies of Case makes it so that the amount of Jokuls that you can play in this deck goes from 9 copies down to 5. Of course, you can play Chaotic Elements to kind of make up for this, and that gives you still 5 copies of Jokul, but I do think, like, whenever you don't open Jokul, it is much easier to get interrupted in this deck. Like, even if you open Chaotic Elements to find the Jokul, that can get ashed. But if you hard draw the Jokul with the Sulfador, that cannot get ashed. So this deck with 3 Jokuls played a lot better through hand traps. Even Noroi, like, it's a good starter in this deck, but if that gets impermed, you don't necessarily have a play without Jokul, because Jokul is like the one really reliable extender that you have. 3 inclusion helps as a way to start your plays and extend, so that is good. And I do think this deck is a force to be reckoned with. You know, it's still a pretty disgusting concept, honestly. The Spell Canceller lock backed up by Infinity and all the other things that this deck can do. It's a strong deck. I do think it's good, but I'm a little hesitant. It's kind of like this like all-in approach. I don't think it's particularly good at going second. Not even, like, some decks in the format might not even lose to Spell Canceller. Like, even Draco Tail has more ways to play with, like, Cartesias and Fallen of White and stuff like that that doesn't involve spell cards. So remains to be seen how good it actually is. I'm afraid I might be underestimating it just because it's not my playstyle, but I'm going to put it in good decks. I think it is a good deck. We're going to see it top regionals. We might see it top YCSs. I personally don't consider it one of the best choices in the format, but I know that other people rate this sort of like combo playstyle higher than I do. So I wouldn't be surprised if some people end up taking it to bigger tournaments and then also doing well with it. But yeah. Yummy. Pure Yummy, unfortunately, as someone who's played this deck a lot, and it always was my favorite version of the deck, I think Pure Yummy is very mediocre with the new changes. I think there is potential with hybrid variations. We're going to talk about that in a second. But Pure Yummy, unfortunately, I don't really see a direction you can take this, or rather, I also don't really see a reason to play it from a competitive standpoint. Like, yes, if you really adore the playstyle of Pure Yummy and it's really your favorite deck, like, you can definitely still bring it to locals and regionals and do okay with it. But from a competitive standpoint, I don't think there's a reason to play it, right? Like your end board isn't particularly good. Your going second isn't particularly good with one snatchy because it's way easier to interact with your combos if you can't quick synchro because you're out of snatchies immediately. It's tough for pure Yami out here. So if you're trying to like still get that feeling of playing a Yami deck, but you want it to be a little bit more competitive, I recommend Yami Sulfur Cord. I think Yami Sulfur Cord is a solid deck. It's either all right or good, in my opinion. The lists for this are relatively streamlined, relatively standard, but this thing has a couple of things going for it, which is that it actually lets you put up a strong end board in Yami still, because the Sulfur Cord cards make up for the Herald loss. The fact that Grand Sulfur Cord Kulia is an Omni Negate makes it so that you can force Nibiru earlier in the combo because you threaten to make it, and then your opponent has to nib, and then you can do the good old Yami thing of like saving your surprise and making Link Spider out of the token, and then you keep playing, and that's fine because you forced the nib early. So that's an important thing for Yami to have. And then also, if you don't get nibbed, your end board actually has teeth, you know, in this deck, because the Sulfur Cord cards add a couple of disruptions to the mix, and I think that's good. They also help you go second. They help you play better into boards because you can activate Sulfur Cord Happiness and special summon a bunch of Sulfur Cords from your hand. So I think if there is a viable version of Yami, it could be this one. I think this one is potentially viable. Another one that I don't have a list for is Yami Tri-Brigade, which I also think is a good deck. I've seen first experimentations with it, but I haven't experimented with it enough or tested it enough to really provide a deck list for it. But I think Yami Tri-Brigade could work. The reason why I think it's a little bit worse than Yami Sulfur Cord is because I don't think it has the capabilities of playing through Nibiru as well, and you don't have an Omni Negate, so like when your Draco Tail opponent activates Rahu or Ketu, you can't really stop it, and then it's going to be really tough because they start forcing all of your stuff with non-target effects. So having that Omni Negate really is, I think, crucial for the Sulfur Cord variation. So honestly, I think it's probably more like this, you know, like pure Yami, really hard to make it work. Tri-Brigade Yami seems pretty fun and honestly not bad, but Sulfur Cord Yami, in my personal opinion, is like the most promising version of the deck if you want to play a Yami deck. So that's where I stand on that. All right, Malice. Malice, I think, is now a mediocre deck without Windbinder. You lose a lot of angles. Like, I am aware that if you go full combo uninterrupted, you can still put up some pretty disgusting boards in Malice, but honestly, that's what most modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks and most modern combo decks can do. That is not really like something that would set apart Malice from other decks. I think there were two things that set Malice, or three things that set Malice apart from other combo decks in the metagame. The first thing was its strong non-engine, because it could play Dominus Impulse and had so much room for non-engine and drew so many cards. That aspect is almost intact still. You draw less cards now because Whitebinder is gone, but still the rest is like still there. The second aspect that set it apart was its resilience to interruption, you know, like the ability to go into Red Ransom first and then basically search the field spell, then you keep playing, and if you get interrupted, you go for the field spell, banish the Red Ransom, and then go into Whitebinder after was really strong. The problem is that doesn't exist anymore. Like, you can go Red Ransom first, and then if you get interrupted later, you can activate the field spell, but you don't really have the Whitebinder extension from there on out. Like, you don't get the Whitebinder from that point on. And the third thing that was so good, and I think that's the most important part, is the follow-up for this deck was insane. Like, the Malice follow-up was completely busted because of Whitebinder, because you would go like March Hare or GWC on the opponent's turn, bring the Whitebinder back, potentially draw a card, then banish some of your grave, some of your opponent's grave, and that would trigger all of your effects. And then if your opponent doesn't kill you, all of your stuff ends up back in the graveyard, and then the next turn you could do it all again, right? Whitebinder, banish your entire grave, they all come back. You still have March Hare for some follow-up, but you simply don't get the full package anymore. You don't get the draw, the banish on your grave, the banish on the opponent's grave, and the infinite follow-up, basically, that Whitebinder provided. And it's also going to be a lot harder to set your traps back from the graveyard. So GWC is actually gone now, unless you go through the hassle of banishing it from the grave and then putting it back into the deck with Heartscriptor. You can't just go Whitebinder, reset it every turn to regain your life points as well. That's another thing. Like, now without Whitebinder, if the GWC is gone and you can't get it back easily, you actually do run out of life points eventually. So on a lot of axes, I think this deck just doesn't work anymore, or rather, if it does work, it just doesn't do it better than other decks anymore. And I I really hope I'm right on this one, because like with how long Malice has been around, I wouldn't be surprised if people still tried it and it still did get some results, but I really think Whitebinder ban is the one that's finally going to get rid of it. That's what I truly believe at the moment, and I hope I'm right on that. Draco Tail is, I think, not even the biggest winner of this ban list, because it did get hit with Ketu to 1 and Mululu to 1, which does matter. It makes the deck weaker in the grind game, and it does definitely have an impact on it. But if the OCG is anything to go by, they have 1 Mululu and 1 Ketu as well. They actually have the exact same hits on Draco Tail. And Draco Tail is the most popular and most successful deck over there at the moment. And this is an example list from the OCG using the new Fallen of White card from Burst Protocol alongside the Ecclesia Synchro. And this deck is just really, really strong. You know, I've started testing for YCS Dortmund and I've started using Draco Tail a little bit. And yes, you have to manage your resources. And yes, grinding your opponent out of Draco Tail spell traps is a realistic win condition against this deck now with Ketu being at 1, but still, the new Albaz support adds great layers to this deck. The end boards are stronger now on average, which makes it harder to break, especially for decks that used to be a hard matchup, like, you know, K9 stuff, is now easier to interrupt because you have the Fallen and the Virtuous, and you have access to like Fallen of Albaz on the opponent's turn, which help you pick apart those Jokul openers. It's just an all-around pretty solid deck, you know? It's gotten weaker because Ketu 2-1 really hurts, but overall, I think it gets away from this ban list as probably the best deck in the format, especially early on. And a lot of the other decks that you want to play in the format, you're going to really have to consider how good is the Draco Tail matchup for it. And if the Draco Tail matchup is solid, like it is for Vanquish Soul, for example, then that makes other decks viable. That's the reason why I think Vanquish Soul is strong, is because it's good into Draco Tail, but it's not as good into Draco Tail as it was before, which is why I don't think Vanquish Soul makes it up here. So that is that. And then we're getting to a deck that's actually getting amazing support in Burst Protocol, and that is Radiant Typhoon. This is also, once again, an OCG deck list. It's kind of nice that the OCG and the TCG are a little bit closer together at this point in time, because, you know, the OCG is starting to get rid of Max C, so the deck lists are actually somewhat comparable now, because besides the one Max C, you could basically play this deck list just the same in the TCG once we get Burst Protocol. Whether you play Fiendsmith in this deck or not is up for debate. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but it does give you another quick play spell that you can activate sometimes, so that can help. And it does make Caesar, which is pretty good, into Draco Tail. But realistically, this deck is just really strong. This deck is a very powerful deck. It always had strong grind game and cards that print a lot of card advantage. But now with the new set, it actually gets the new Link 2, which actually makes it provide an end board, you know, because the Link 2 searches MST and gets you the trap for free. So now you actually have a realistically strong enough end board to compete. And it's really grindy, and it has a decent Draco Tail matchup because you can dodge Draco Tail Flame really easily, which puts Draco Tail in some really awkward spots, because if you don't resolve Flame, you can't shuffle back your one Ketu, and then your grind game becomes a little weird, because then with the next trap, you have to decide, do I recycle the other trap or do I recycle the Ketu? If I recycle the Ketu, I only have one trap in rotation and I can get outgrinded. So Radiant Typhoon, really grindy deck, really interesting. I think it's really strong. At the very least, it's up here. Honestly, I would not be surprised if this deck ends up being one of the best decks in the format. But I'm kind of stopping myself from coping too much here, because this deck is like exactly my playstyle. So I'm afraid that I might be a little bit biased on it. So I'm putting it in here. I'm pretty sure it is a strong contender, but maybe I'm viewing it a little bit more positively because it like exactly fits my playstyle, right? So I take it with a grain of salt, but to me, this deck looks pretty amazing. I think it's pretty cool. It's the strong meta contender for sure. Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is not great right now. I don't think it's quite as bad as Pure Yummy and Malice, but the problem is that Blue Eyes always like depends on decks being really stoppable with hand traps, because the Blue Eyes engine plays really poorly into boards. And quite frankly, the whole like Effect Veiler, Purge, Imperm approach right now, it just doesn't consistently stop decks like Draco Tail and Vanquish Soul from playing. You can probably build Blue Eyes in a way where it's solid into decks like Radiant Typhoon and Mitsurugi, because those decks can be hand trapped and then just pass. But even then, the Radiant Typhoon deck has a bunch of Mystical Space Typhoons for your True Light, so I doubt that's a good matchup, actually. It just doesn't match very well into the decks in the format, and the grind game for the decks in the format is also stronger, so Blue Eyes basically only beats these decks if it hand traps them to death, which is not a very good ground to stand on in the current format, I think. Gem Knights. Gem Knights is a solid deck. I don't see a reason why you wouldn't be able to do well with Gem Knights, maybe even with the blind second version in this format, because quite frankly, Draco Tail, Vanquish Soul, Mitsurugi Pure, and Radiant Typhoon, they don't make unbreakable boards. It's actually a pretty healthy looking format in that regard. One of the weaker matchups for this deck would be Crystron, so if Crystron ends up being more popular than some of these decks, then I think blind second Gem Knight is in a tough spot, so it's a little bit dependent on that. But for the most part, Board Breaker Gem Knights could have a pretty good matchup spread into the decks up here, which I think it could even be a better meta call than this one if these decks up here really end up being like the top choices in the format. I can see Gem Knight doing decently well. Orchest. I'm not the biggest fan of Orchest in the TCG because without Nightmare Mermaid, I think the deck is a little bit on the inconsistent side. Honestly, I think they could have brought back Nightmare Mermaid on this ban list and that would have made this deck really interesting. As it is right now, I think pure Orchest is just a little inconsistent. You just don't quite have enough starters without Mermaid. Like with Mermaid, you could play like Sky Striker cards to do your Orchest combo for you without normal summoning. That would be pretty cool. As it stands, pure Orchest, a little bit inconsistent. I could see people play like Orchest Fiendsmith or Orchest Mitsurugi, but that also got weaker because Habakiri is limited. So Orchest, not bad, definitely. It's got strong combos and it's kind of resilient if you do draw a starter, but it's just a little bit too inconsistent for my liking. Other than that, I do like it. Gets to play Impulse, which is also a phenomenal card into a lot of decks up here. It's not great into Radiant Typhoon, but against Draco Tail and Mitsurugi, I think Dominus Impulse is pretty good. Fire King. Fire King is good. I think the pure Fire King deck with the Jurak cards is a decent deck in the format. It's like you do need a specific reason to play it. Like you really gotta like that deck to choose it over the top tier decks in the format, but it's not bad. Like it can actually outgrind some of these decks in the format pretty hard if you resolve some of your Juraks, especially like if you can nuke the entire board and then trigger your Garunix after. That is a game-winning play against a lot of decks up here. And Fire King actually has the ability to outlast a lot of these decks while also destroying the entire field with Jurak Meteor, which is pretty powerful. So don't count out Fire King, especially as long as, you know, Dinkabui is still actively playing the game. So I think there's a chance for Fire King to do well at some regionals and maybe even at YCS's this format. Not my preferred choice, I think, but it's a pretty cool deck and I don't think it's bad. Memento. Memento's decent. Yeah, I mean, Memento hasn't really changed in a while. I think it can still do some Fiendsmith lines via the rank 3 without using Moon, so that's kind of cool. Ending on Memento board plus Caesar is pretty good against Draco Tail. However, this deck is, I think the half boards are not great against Draco Tail, so if you are under a Charmy and you can't do the full combos, then I think you are in trouble, and I do think Molcharmy Fualos and Perulia and Meowls hurt this deck a decent amount. I don't think Meowls is necessarily going to be very popular. I think Perulia and Fualos are going to be though. So Memento is the kind of deck where no non-engine really kills it, but there's also no non-engine that's bad against it, right? Like everything kind of like has value against it. Like whether it's Bell or Imperm or Fuwa or Perulia or Nib or Droll, like everything is like kind of decent against Memento. So you never have that feeling of like your opponent drawing like dead non-engine against you. And even board breakers, same thing. They all do something against Memento. So Memento's fine, but nothing too crazy. Onomat Ryzeal. Now, if you've seen any of my recent Master Duel streams, you know I hate this deck. There's nothing I would like to do more than tell you this deck is awful. But unironically, I think this deck might be a little bit underrated in TCG because I don't see anyone playing it. And I'm not saying it's like the best deck in the format or anything like that, but I feel like if it's this strong in Master Duel, it can't be that bad in the TCG. Especially now that Roland Lockbird is at 2. I do think it's a good deck. I wouldn't surprised if some people started playing it. You're gonna basically just play the game of, does your opponent have Perulia, Fuwa, or Droll? Because those cards murder this deck. If your opponent doesn't have those cards, you play through all the other hand traps like it's basically nothing, because like this deck just spits out level and rank 4s like it's nothing. You can't go Protoss in TCG, thank God, but there's plenty of other things you can do to auto win the game. And especially, I mean, this deck is always going to be paired with Ryzeal, so you're basically doing like Detonator, Cross, some other rank 4s. Baguska is legal in the TCG as well. That's banned in Master Duel. So I think there's a world where this deck is good in the TCG. I don't like to admit it, but I do think this deck is pretty decent. Other Ryziel variations, Ryziel Mitsurugi could be good, and Ryziel in general. Pure Ryziel is not really a thing, right? So I guess this represents Mitsurugi Ryziel, which is also probably fine. Yeah, it's fine, just fine. You know, Ryziel cards are still pretty high quality, so maybe like a small Ryziel package in Mitsurugi could work. I could see that. Mermail, you can still hand loop, but I wasn't a big fan of this deck in the recent formats. Haven't seen many people play it, but I also don't really see a reason to. Without Water Statue, it gets even worse. Thankfully, that card is gone. You can still do some pretty crazy things. I'm pretty sure if Neptibus resolves going first uninterrupted, you still win the game every time. So I'm not even sure how much the Water Barrier Statue ban matters for this deck. But the thing is, like, even if you hand loop 3 cards with like Mooling Glacier and Trishula or something like that, or you can, I think you can even hand loop 4, right? You can Mooling Glacier 2, you can banish one with Trishula, you can banish one with Minstrel and shuffle it back from the banished pile so they don't get it back. So you're hand looping 4 cards. The thing is, like, even hand looping 4 cards, you can lose to some decks in the format if like the last card in hand is, or one of the last 2 cards in hand is 1 or 2 good starters / extenders, you could still lose. So without Water Barrier Statue, thankfully this deck does not completely auto win anymore, and overall that just takes a lot of appeal away from the deck, thankfully. DDD, I'm not a fan of DDD, man. Not just do I not like its playstyle because it's so combo heavy, but I also just don't think it's very good. Like, I've played against DDD a couple of times, and for how much this deck combos, its boards are actually surprisingly weak if they do get interrupted in 1 or 2 spots. You know, like they usually get something done, even if you have like Nibiru or Bystials or other interactions. They probably still make like an end board, but that's usually been like fine for me to play through. It's all right. It's not terrible, but I personally don't think it's very good from my impression of playing against it, I shall say. Like, I haven't played it myself much because I just know I don't like playing this deck, so I haven't really put much work into it. But playing against it, it always seemed just fine. Nothing incredibly good, but also not terrible. Eniacraft. Eniacraft is unfortunately an unfinished concept. I tried this deck at locals last week and it was fun. It's fun and it's genuinely not a bad concept, but it's not finished. Unfortunately, this is the case with multiple of the Phantom Revenge archetypes, actually all 3 of them. They are cool concepts, but they just don't work yet. And Eniacraft is the perfect example of this. There is just some problems in the format right now that Eniacraft simply cannot beat. Like, Murakumo still exists. Draco Tail is a horrible matchup. There's too many weaknesses in Eniacraft until we get the new support. After the new support, we might be talking. We will definitely be trying Eniacraft again when those cards drop. But for now, I don't think it's very good. Exosister. I think Exosister is at least here, which is not super high, but also not bad considering it is Exosister. I would not be surprised if it was a little bit better than this, though. Like, the more I think about it, the more I feel like the new Exosister cards are really high quality. I would not be surprised if this deck ends up being like somewhat capable, like in the middle of the mix of like these decks up here. Like, I genuinely don't think there is much setting these decks apart from each other in terms of power. Or like power, yes, but like this deck is a little bit less powerful or unfair than some decks up here, but it's going to make up for that with more consistency now, more non-engine, and like a pretty strong grind game. So I could see this deck being even a little bit better than this, but I'm a little hesitant to put it higher because it is Exosister and you still have to play some of the mediocre old names in the deck, which I don't think is perfect. So yeah. White Forest. Pretty good deck, honestly. Pretty scary. Roll at 2 now. Very strong combo potential. Wasn't hit on the ban list whatsoever. Scared to say it because, you know, that deck is very dangerous and very hard to go second against, but I think White Forest kind of benefits from this ban list, so we're going to have to wait and see how that goes. White Forest also surprisingly capable of breaking boards if you play board breakers in it. The cards themselves are not great into boards, but the board breakers are decent. I think the decks up here, they could be beaten by White Forest when it goes second. I think White Forest is a good combo deck for the upcoming format. I don't know if it's better than Chris Strong K9. I doubt it, but it's a good deck. Sky Striker. All right. wouldn't be a Josh tier list without some Sky Striker copium. I think Sky Striker is well positioned if these are the top tier decks in the format. I think Sky Striker is something that you can do decently well with against Draco Tail. I think you can outgrind it, especially now that Ketu is at 1. You have a million ways to dodge Draco Tail Flame. So you ruin their first recycle, and then you can really go from there. I think Board Breaker, Sky Striker, whether it's going first or second, has some potential in this format. The only thing that I don't know if it does anything better than Radiant Typhoon, to be honest with you. Because, like, Radiant Typhoon feels like it does a lot of things that Sky Striker does, but it's, like, stronger at going first. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's a reason to play Striker over Radiant Typhoon. I gotta find that out. But they do very similar things in this format, and I think they are not badly positioned. Especially both of these decks, I think, are pretty bad into Malice, and Malice is gone. So that's good. That was the worst matchup for Sky Striker last format, besides Lunalight, which is unfortunately also a strong contender, depending on... That's the thing with Lunalight. It's always depending on, do other decks prepare for it? You know, like, for example, Draco Tail has ways to out Liger Dancer if you want to play them, right? You can put Titanic Lad in the extra deck. You can outplay Liger Dancer with Albion the Sanctifier Dragon by giving your opponent monsters in attack mode every turn and then attacking them, and then you have to stall the Liger with, like, the Draco Tail cards, but that's possible if it's just one Liger. Vanquish Soul can beat Liger, Mitsurugi can beat Liger, so in theory, if people are experienced with the Lunalight matchup and understand how to play against Liger Dancer, the deck shouldn't be that strong. In practice, though, you know, decks like Draco Tail have always struggled against Liger Dancer, even if in theory it was outable. So Lunalight is a strong contender, wasn't hit on the ban list at all. Even Baguska was allowed to stay, which I honestly didn't expect, or didn't want at least. So it's got to be reckoned with. But if people get careless and don't prepare for Liger anymore, then you can always do well with Lunalight. So I think Lunalight is a strong contender. And this would also, you know, the meta is always a development. If Lunalight ends up being popular or more popular than you think, then Striker and Radiant Typhoon will struggle because it's hard for those decks to out Liger. If not impossible, depending on the list. But you got to do some really, really inconvenient stuff to beat a Liger Dancer with these decks. So if Lunalight is popular, these two decks will suffer. If Lunalight is not popular, then these two decks can thrive. And then vice versa, if these two decks are popular, Lunalight might be a good call. If these two decks are not popular, then Lunalight might not be a good call, right? So these three kind of depend on each other. Cool Tune. Cool Tune is better than ENIAC Craft right now, but it's still not great. It needs the support that it gets in Blazing Dominion. I really feel like in terms of the timing, it would have been much better if they put the support into Burst Protocol instead of Blazing Dominion, so you could play the decks now instead of having to wait for 3 more months. But Cool Tune will get good with the new support, I personally believe. I think the new support is pretty strong. For now, it's just an unfinished concept, unfortunately. Branded. Branded's good. I think there's more ways to play Branded now with the new Albaz after Burst Protocol, and I think Branded could make its way into the format again. I would not be surprised if Branded ends up being a viable deck. I think there is going to be 2 main ways we're going to see Branded. There is the basically 60 card or close to 60 card, like Power Spell, still very Branded Fusion focused version of the deck. But I could also see 40 card, more streamlined versions with centering around Fallen of White, seeing some play. I've seen people mess around with those, and those looked also pretty strong. And that deck doesn't rely on Branded Fusion as much because some of the Fallen of White combos are also pretty strong in it with the Synchro. Of course, that's one of the main things to consider when you're playing Branded. You don't unleash the full potential of the Fallen of White if you want to activate Branded Fusion because you can't make the Ecclesia Synchro in the turn that you activate Branded Fusion. You can't do both on the same turn, which I actually think is pretty cool in terms of the design. I like that they're moving away from the deck only centering about Branded Fusion all the time. So that is pretty cool. I'm excited to see if people can take Branded into some new directions and make it work. The problem is the version that I'm referring to, the version without Branded Fusion or with less focus on Branded Fusion, maybe more synchro heavy as well, with like, you can do all kinds of things with Branded, right? They got synchros, like this pattern is also part of Branded. Like you can do so much more with Branded. Those were always the subpar versions. It was always better to just activate Branded Fusion. And so I guess we'll see if the Fallen of White actually gives you enough reason to play Branded in a different way, and whether that's actually good enough to like break into the top tier of the format. But I do think the deck is good at the very least. So yeah, that's my first impression of the format. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of Draco Tail, but there's some other decks I'm really looking forward to messing around. I'm a believer in Vanquish Soul, Radiant Typhoon, Sky Striker, and Pure Mitsu. I think those decks are all really solid. And all of these decks in good here, I could very well see one of these decks having a breakout performance and doing even better than what I'm rating them at here. Like all of these decks have like YCS topping potential. The decks under these are like more like regional top potential, I would say. Like I wouldn't be surprised if someone topped the regional with these, but at YCSs I would be surprised if someone made it into top cut with these. And then the decks down here I just wouldn't recommend playing right now. But that's my first impression. Let me know what you thought of the inclusion of like some example deck lists and so on and so forth. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it wasn't too long as well, but I feel like new ban list, lots of stuff to talk about, lots of stuff to rant about, and you guys always tell me you like when I do longer videos like this. So hope you enjoyed, hope it was helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe. We're getting really close to 100K. I really want to hit that in the upcoming weeks or months if possible. So if you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to support me in that way. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time, duelists. Bye bye.